Join the conversation as usual. Text 85058. But first, President Obama has chosen to use the N-word during an interview where he was making a point about race issues in America. The White House insists that the president didn't set out to shock when he told comedian Mark Maron on his podcast that though race relations had improved over his lifetime, the US wasn't cured of racism. Joining us now is Dr. Neal A. Lester, Director of the Project Humanities at Arizona State University. And I believe, Dr. Lester, that you taught the first college class exploring the N-word.
To my knowledge, that is correct. I have had no evidence to the contrary, and I've taught that class 4 times to 4 different sets of students.
It has a complex history.
It has a complex history, and what I find out in teaching that class is that I learn a lot about our American history as well, and that the history of the word is as important as its modern use.
How did you feel about the president choosing, and he does, he's known for his deliberate use of certain words.
He is, and I didn't see it out of character. I think there's a certain sort of comfortability that he has now that perhaps he didn't have in the first few years. He knows he's going out, but I also think there's a certain level of awareness that he brings to race that can be conveyed that other presidents cannot. No other president could have used that word. I mean, if another president who didn't look like that president used the word, this would have been something that no one could contain. But there are ways in which this president really has, drawn outside the lines, and this is one of those ways. What makes it different than some of the celebrities here in the States when they use that word is they use it in the context of other equally problematic statements. So it's not just the use of the word, and I think that in terms of the use of the word by the president is it really uncovers a kind of rawness that has not been dealt with in American race relations. So keep in mind that the context of the comment was the ways in which polite people who don't use that word or any other epithet or burn crosses or lynch people still have race bias. And that race bias can play out in sometimes very, very provocative ways that would not necessarily identify people as racially biased.
So it's all about context, or is it purely the people who use it?
It's about context, but it's also about history, though. I mean, I think President Obama, of all the presidents we've had here, has come out and made comments about race. He's gotten involved in race conversations. In fact, during the 2000 election, he presented what was for most...
But not as much as he could have done, has he? I mean, a lot of the time he's passed the buck.
Nobody has done as much as what you could have done, but also there's no reason to imagine that we are going to solve the race problem here in the 21st century that has been the problem of the 20th century. So I don't know what the most one could do because one can't necessarily wipe away the bias that's in people's hearts and minds. But what you can do is confront those biases in the way that he is saying that this is today's racism without racist. So you can be just as racially biased without calling people epithets or without lynching or hanging nooses. And I think that's what the issue is, that people are very polite and we're very politically correct. And I think there was a sort of raw nerve that was hit there. What's interesting is that we've gotten so preoccupied with the word that we haven't listened or paid attention to the rest of what he said.
What did you think about the rest of the speech? I mean, he
I
was talking so much about guns as well, and
Right.
that element of the conversation, that element of the debate, it has just drifted by, hasn't it?
Well, it's interesting because it caught our attention, but it caught our attention in ways that are potentially distracting. And I said this when I first heard his assessment of South Carolina as being about gun control. Sandy Hook was about gun control. This is specifically about race, especially when it comes out of the perpetrator's mouth, that he wants to start a race war, and he goes on and on about how the racists have created problems for the United States. An embracing of the Confederate flag here, particularly in the South, is akin to a kind of racism that left people very segregated and black people very tormented, victimized, and abused. And so I think in many ways, this is a kind of raw conversation that people are not having because we're too polite and we're sipping tea or drinking lemonade, and we say we don't have bodies hanging from poplar trees as we did in Mississippi and Alabama, but we still have problems that we're trying to deal with in terms of the relations between underrepresented groups or minorities and police here in the States. So there's a certain rawness. To shift the conversation to gun control does not look at the images that we have seen of young black black men killed, not necessarily by guns in Baltimore. And even though there were 3 blacks and 3 whites, the victim is still a young black man. So the issue of race is still very raw. It's hard to talk about. And I think this has gotten people talking. I just wish the shift was on the essence of what he said in that particular moment, which is that racism is more subtle now. But it does not mean that it's gone, nor are we in a post-racial moment just because he is president.
Yeah, well, that definitely isn't true. I mean, because
Well, some people say it is here, though.
I was looking at some statistics the other day, and looking back to 2008, so when Obama first took office,
Correct.
149 far-right militia groups.
Correct.
And then if you look now,
Correct.
more than 1,000.
Correct.
More than 1,000.
But that's one of the reasons that, I see it as a kind of backlash, because I think having a president who was not white, and I know Obama is biracial, but he's a president who is not white, as white has been defined in this country, has really thrown people. And so there have been so many attacks on his person that, in my eyes, can only be racialized. When we are calling him and First Lady Michelle Obama chimpanzees and apes and monkeys, and you see a proliferation of social media that attack him, where he was born. This is all about one's identity, not about one's policies. But he has been a little more...
but offensive terms have been used about, to be fair, every single president in recent times.
But none have been racialized like that. None have been racialized like that. Even with President Bush, that was about his intellect, not about his race.
His intellect is where he came from as well?
Well, that's not his race, though. That's not his fundamental identity.
And
one's identity of being born.
We can attack every single other part and any other facet of the person, but not the race.
That's right, because race is still such a hot-button issue in this country. That's why we have civil wars. That's why we're fighting now some to keep the Confederate flag up, because it's about a certain kind of American patriotism that romanticizes the good old days. And the good old days were not good old days for everybody who lived in the South. It was also a fight to hold on to people as property, as chattel, as property that could be accumulated. That's what that war was about. And there are people who are still enacting that. And these are polite people who would never call somebody out of their names, but who would still hold on to this as though it is some pride of accomplishment, when in fact that flag should not be celebrated in that way, that also represents disparaging, victimization, and actual death for certain groups of people in the South, particularly.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Neal A. Lester there, Director of Project Humanities at Arizona State University. It's interesting, isn't it? We've talked about the flag. We've talked about name-calling, in effect, there, the use of certain words and race. And a major part of what Obama talked about was guns. 310 million guns in Britain, in the US, nearly 30,000 gun-related deaths a year. And we focus on the words there. Much more to come. You're listening to Up All Night. I'm Charlie Charlton. It is 2:15.